Let me tell you something strange about people who observe more than they speak. We live in a world that celebrates the loudest voice in the room, where silence is mistaken for absence and stillness for disengagement. Maybe you're one of them, the ones who listen while others fill the air with words, who notice the shift in someone's expression when everyone else is still talking. And maybe no one has ever explained to you why you do this, or why it sometimes feels like you're watching life through glass, while others seem to be living inside it. If you want to understand what you feel without labels, and find words to explain yourself without justifying, stay here. This isn't about fixing you or teaching you to speak more. Here we translate psychology into relief, not diagnosis. We look at the quiet ones not as broken versions of extroverts, but as people who've discovered something the noise drowns out. Because maybe observation isn't passivity. Maybe it's the most active thing you can do, to truly see, to genuinely listen, to hold space for what's unfolding without needing to redirect it toward yourself. The world calls this shyness, social anxiety, or lack of confidence. It pathologizes your silence as something to overcome, a barrier between you and success. But what if it's the opposite? What if observing more than you speak is a quiet form of emotional intelligence, a sophisticated way of being present that most people never develop? What if your silence isn't empty, but full of attention, discernment, and a rare kind of respect for the weight that words actually carry? Because while others are preparing their next sentence, you're reading the room. While they're performing personality, you're noticing who's pretending and who's real. Your quietness isn't weakness, it's clarity. It's the ability to see patterns in behavior, to sense what's underneath the surface, to understand people not from what they say, but from everything they do when they think no one's watching. And maybe that's not something to fix. Maybe that's something the world desperately needs more of. People who know how to witness without consuming, who can hold silence without needing to break it. We live in a culture that rewards the opposite, where presence has become performance and silence feels like failure, where every gathering is an audition and every conversation a chance to prove you exist. Social media taught us that visibility equals value, that if you're not constantly narrating your life, you're somehow living it less. But maybe the real noise is having to show yourself to exist. Maybe the real emptiness is in the constant need to fill every moment with sound, every pause with proof that you matter. You've felt it. The exhaustion of spaces where listening is just waiting to talk, where people collect experiences to broadcast rather than absorb. The modern world runs on a dopamine cycle of immediate response, instant reaction, hot takes, delivered before the thought has even finished forming. And somewhere in that frenzy, observation became obsolete. Depth became a luxury no one can afford. But you never learned to live that way. You still pause before you speak. You still let silence settle. And the world interprets that as hesitation when really it's discernment. This creates a peculiar kind of loneliness. You're surrounded by people, but you're operating on a different frequency. They mistake your observation for judgment, your thoughtfulness for distance, your careful words for coldness. They don't understand that you're not withholding yourself, you're protecting something sacred. That not everything needs to be said, not every thought needs an audience, not every feeling requires external validation. But in a culture addicted to exposure, restraint looks like rejection. So you learn to perform sometimes. You laugh louder than you feel. You contribute commentary that costs you nothing. You learn the social scripts that make you seem more there than you are. And it works. People relax around you. They stop asking if you're okay. They stop treating your silence like a problem to solve. But inside, you know the difference. You know that performing presence and being present are not the same thing. And you know that your real attention, the kind that actually sees people, only happens in the quiet you're constantly asked to break. Psychologists call this reflective observation, the capacity to process experience internally before expressing it externally. It's a form of emotional regulation that develops when someone learns that words have consequences, that speech is a form of action, that once something is said, it can't be unsaid. People who observe more than they speak tend to have what's called an internal locus of evaluation. That means your sense of truth comes from inside, from your own careful assessment of reality, rather than from the consensus of whoever speaks loudest. In other words, you're not quiet because you have nothing to say. You're quiet because you understand the weight of saying something. You've learned that most conversations don't actually require your input, that people often aren't looking for truth or insight. They're looking for agreement, for validation, for an echo of what they already believe. And you've decided, consciously or not, that you'd rather say nothing than say something hollow. That's not anxiety. That's integrity. That's knowing the difference between adding value and adding noise. This also relates to what neuropsychology calls sensory processing sensitivity, a trait found in roughly 20% of the population. These are people whose nervous systems pick up more information from their environment, who notice subtleties others miss, who feel the emotional temperature of a room the moment they enter it. If you're one of them, observation isn't a choice, it's how your brain naturally operates. You can't not notice the micro-expression, the shift in tone, the thing someone said that contradicted what they said 10 minutes ago. Your awareness is turned up, which means your need for processing time is higher. Silence isn't absence for you. It's where integration happens, and there's a quiet power in that. While others are reacting, you're synthesizing. While they're defending positions they adopted 5 seconds ago, you're still testing yours against reality. Your slower pace isn't a disadvantage. It's depth. It's the ability to hold complexity, to resist the pressure to simplify everything into a take, to let understanding develop over time instead of crystallizing instantly. You're not behind in the conversation. You're operating at a different resolution. And maybe the world would make better decisions if more people learned to think the way you naturally do, slowly, carefully, with full awareness of what speech actually costs. Of course, it doesn't always come from peace. Sometimes observation is armor. Sometimes silence is the safest place you've found, not because you've chosen it, but because speaking up once cost you something you couldn't afford to lose. Maybe you said the wrong thing and watched someone leave. Maybe you shared something true and had it used against you. Maybe you were punished for being honest. So you learned to edit yourself into something smaller, something safer, something that couldn't hurt or be hurt. And that's real too. That's the shadow side of this. The part where observation becomes hiding, where thoughtfulness becomes paralysis, where the fear of saying the wrong thing becomes the inability to say anything at all. There are people who are quiet because they're healing, because they're protecting a tenderness the world hasn't earned access to yet, because once upon a time they were open and it went badly, and now they're learning to trust again, one careful word at a time. If that's you, your silence isn't strength yet. But it's not weakness either. It's convalescence. It's the necessary withdrawal before re-emergence. But here's what matters. Even protective silence serves you. Even cautious observation is a form of self-care. Because you're not shutting down, you're being selective. You're not disconnecting, you're choosing connection that actually nourishes you instead of depletes you. And maybe that's the lesson the world doesn't want you to learn, that you don't owe everyone access, that your attention is valuable, that some rooms don't deserve your words, and some conversations aren't worth the energy it takes to participate in them. Fear and wisdom can look identical from the outside. Sometimes you stay quiet because you're afraid. Sometimes you stay quiet because you're smart. And sometimes, often, it's both. The person who's been burned learns discernment. The person who's been dismissed learns to value their own voice enough not to waste it. So yes, not all silence comes from strength, but all silence that teaches you something becomes strength eventually. And maybe what you're doing isn't hiding. Maybe it's learning who deserves to hear you, and that's the most important lesson of all. Observing more than you speak isn't withdrawal, it's discernment. Staying quiet isn't coldness, it's conservation of something precious. Listening while others perform isn't passivity, it's the radical act of actually being present. Because in a world where everyone's racing to be heard, you've discovered something rare. That reception is as powerful as transmission. That sometimes the most important thing you can offer isn't your opinion, it's your attention. That being witnessed is a gift you give by being quiet enough to truly see. Think of it this way. Noise isn't just sound. Noise is information without meaning, stimulation without nourishment, connection without depth. And most modern conversation has become exactly that, an exchange of reactions, a performance of relatability, a competition to see who can be most present without actually being there at all. But you never learned to communicate that way. You still believe words should mean something, that if you're going to break silence, it should be because you have something worth the breaking. That's not social deficit, that's standards. Speaking less isn't about having less to say. It's about respecting the sacredness of genuine expression. Observing more isn't about hiding from life. It's about refusing to live it second-hand, filtered through performance and pretense. You're not on the sidelines. You're in a different game entirely, one that most people don't even know exists. One where presence isn't measured in airtime, but in quality of awareness. Where connection isn't about filling space, but about honoring it. Where silence isn't the absence of something, it's the presence of everything that matters. And here's what nobody tells you. The people who truly see you, the ones worth being seen by, they recognize this immediately. They feel the quality of your attention. They notice that when you finally speak, it lands differently. That your words aren't filler or performance. They're considered, they're real, they cost you something to say. And those people don't need you to be louder. They need you to be exactly what you are. Someone who knows the difference between empty and full, between present and performed, between speaking because you should and speaking because you must. There's a person I know who spent years trying to be more outgoing. They read the books, practiced the techniques, forced themselves into conversations that felt like sandpaper against their soul. At parties, they'd stand in the center of the room, contributing commentary, matching energy, doing everything right according to the social script. And they were exhausted, not just tired, hollowed out, like they were spending some internal currency they couldn't replenish. Because they weren't being more themselves. They were being less, spread thin across interactions that required performance, but never touched presence. When they finally stopped, when they let themselves exist at their natural pace, speak at their natural frequency, give attention instead of chasing it, something unexpected happened. They didn't become more isolated. They became more connected. Because the people who stayed were the ones who wanted what they actually had to offer: depth, real listening, the kind of conversation that happens when someone isn't already planning their next sentence. Studies show that people with reflective observation tendencies tend to form fewer relationships, but report higher satisfaction in the ones they have. They're not collecting connections, they're cultivating them. But the most beautiful part isn't the research. It's the moment when theory becomes peace, when someone who's spent their whole life being told they're too quiet finally understands there's nothing to about them, they're exactly the right amount. Their silence isn't a rough draft of speech, it's a complete sentence. Their observation isn't preparation for participation, it's participation itself, just in a language the noisy world forgot how to read. That person stopped apologizing for taking time to respond, stopped forcing laughter that didn't come naturally, stopped treating their quietness like a deficit that needed offsetting with performance. And what they found wasn't loneliness, it was sovereignty. The freedom to exist at their own pace, in their own way, without constantly translating themselves into something more digestible for people who were never really listening anyway. They didn't become more present by being louder. They became more present by finally fully arriving as themselves. It's not about closing off. It's about choosing when to open. You can say, I process things internally before I share them. Or you can say, I show care through attention, not through filling silence. You can say, I like being with people. I just need quiet before and after. That's not detachment. That's self-awareness. That's knowing your own architecture and honoring it instead of constantly apologizing for not being built like everyone else. The world will keep asking you to speak up, to contribute more, to prove you're engaged by being audibly present. And sometimes you will, because context matters and flexibility is part of living with other humans. But you don't have to mistake accommodation for identity. You don't have to believe that the social performance is the real you and the quiet observer is the broken version. They're both real, but only one costs you nothing to sustain. Here's the language that might help. My silence isn't judgment, it's respect. And because you're not withholding commentary, you're waiting until you have something true to say. My observation isn't distance, it's how I love people. Because you're not checked out. You're paying the kind of attention most people never receive. I'm not quiet because I'm empty. I'm quiet because I'm full. Full of things that take time to articulate. Full of observations that don't fit into casual commentary. Full of a way of being that doesn't require constant external proof. And when someone misunderstands, when they interpret your thoughtfulness as disinterest, your depth as aloofness, your careful words as coldness, you can let them. Not everyone will understand. Not everyone needs to. The people who matter will feel the difference between your silence and absence. They'll recognize that you're not withholding yourself. You're offering something most people have forgotten how to give. Genuine, undivided, unperformed presence. And that's not something you need to explain. That's something that people who are ready for it will simply feel. Not every silence is emptiness. Sometimes it's where the soul learns to breathe again. Sometimes it's the space between who you're expected to be and who you actually are. Sometimes it's not absence at all. It's the fullest kind of presence, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself to exist. And maybe observing more than you speak isn't escape. Maybe it's the way back to yourself, the way back to meaning in a world drowning in noise, the way back to connection that actually connects, conversation that actually communicates, presence that actually matters. Because you've discovered something the loud world keeps missing. That being seen isn't the same as being visible. That being heard isn't the same as being loud. That mattering isn't measured in airtime or impact or the number of times you successfully inserted yourself into the narrative. It's measured in the quality of your awareness, the integrity of your attention, the care with which you choose what's worth saying and what's worth holding in silence. And that's not a deficit, that's mastery. So here's the question that nobody asks. What part of you has the world never understood, but that, in silence, you learned to respect? What would happen if you stopped treating your natural rhythm as something to overcome and started treating it as information? As a valid way of being that doesn't require correction, only recognition. As a form of presence that the noisy world needs desperately but keeps mistaking for absence. If this gave you words to understand what you've always felt, if it named something that's been living in you unnamed, then maybe you've found your people. Here we speak about what the world never validated, but you've always known. That silence can be sacred, that observation is a form of love, that some of the most present people in the room are the ones who never fight for the spotlight. You're not too quiet. You're exactly right. And the world is slowly, finally, learning to listen.